I work as a part-time cashier at a local supermarket in a small town. It's not the most exciting job, but it's decent for getting by while saving for college. The place has been around for decades and has that nostalgic charm of an old store. Squeaky carts, faintly buzzing fluorescent lights, and a bell over the door that chimes whenever someone walks in. But it also has its downsides, like working the closing shift. This happened about 6 months ago, during one of those late-night shifts. We close at 11 p.m., but as usual, there were a few last-minute customers lingering, ignoring the closing announcements. It was a slow Tuesday night, and the manager on duty, Laura, was busy in the back office counting the registers while I was stuck manning the only open checkout lane. By 10:45, the store was almost empty, save for one man who seemed to be wandering aimlessly. He was tall, thin, and dressed in a long gray coat that looked too heavy for the warm weather. He carried an empty shopping basket and kept circling the aisles, never picking anything up. His movements were deliberate, almost robotic, and his expression was blank, like he was lost in thought. At first, I thought he might just be indecisive, but as I watched him from the checkout counter, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. Every time he turned a corner, his head would snap toward me, his eyes locking on mine. It wasn't a passing glance. It was an unblinking, hollow stare that lasted just long enough to feel wrong. Then he'd turn and continue down the aisle as if nothing had happened. I tried to ignore it and focused on tidying up the counter, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The man's movements became more erratic, and his pacing quickened. At one point, I thought he'd left, but then I spotted him again. This time standing completely still at the end of aisle 9, partially hidden behind the shelves. The way he stood there, half in shadow, gave me the creeps. His head was tilted slightly, and though I couldn't see his face clearly, I knew he was staring at me. My chest tightened as I tried to focus on anything else. Just a weirdo, I told myself. He'll leave when we close. At 10:55, I decided to lock the doors to prevent any new customers from coming in. Laura was still in the back, and the store felt too quiet. I walked over to the entrance, my footsteps echoing against the tile floor. As I reached for the lock, I glanced outside and saw that the parking lot was completely empty. There wasn't a single car, not even mine. My heart sank. I knew I'd parked there when I arrived. Where was my car? I turned back toward the aisles, scanning for the man, but he was nowhere in sight. That's when I heard the sound. It was faint at first, like the rustling of paper, but it quickly grew louder. A repetitive scraping noise coming from aisle 9. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. "The store is closing." No response. Against my better judgment, I walked toward the noise, clutching my phone in one hand. As I approached aisle 9, the sound stopped abruptly. The aisle was empty. No sign of the man, no sign of anything unusual. I stood there for a moment, listening to the silence, when suddenly I felt a cold breeze behind me. I spun around, expecting to see someone, but the aisle behind me was empty. My hands shook as I backed away, bumping into a display of canned goods. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him. He was standing at the far end of the next aisle, his face partially obscured by the shelves. His mouth was twisted into a faint, unnatural smile, and his eyes, sunken and dark, seemed to glint under the harsh fluorescent lights. He took a slow step forward, then another, his movements unnervingly deliberate. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the cans scattered on the floor. "You need to leave," I managed to say, my voice shaking. "We're closed." The man didn't respond. Instead, he tilted his head further, his smile widening. Then, without warning, he turned and walked toward the back of the store, disappearing into the shadows. I ran to the office, slamming the door behind me. Laura looked up from the desk, startled. "What's wrong?" she asked. "There's a guy out there," I gasped. "He's acting weird." Laura frowned and stood up, grabbing the phone. "Stay here," she said. "I'll check it out." I waited in the office, listening to the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. Minutes passed, but Laura didn't come back. My anxiety spiked as I debated whether to call the police. Then, I heard the chime of the front doorbell. I peeked out of the office and saw Laura walking toward me, her expression confused. "There's no one here," she said. "What do you mean?" "He was just—" "Whoever it was must have left," she interrupted. "Let's just lock up and go." I nodded, grabbing my bag and keys. Together, we locked the doors and stepped outside. My car was back in its spot, as if it had never been moved. Laura gave me a puzzled look, but I couldn't explain it. I drove home in silence, my hands gripping the wheel tightly. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that man's face, his twisted smile, his hollow eyes. I never saw him again, but sometimes, when I'm alone in the store late at night, I feel like he's still watching me. I've been working at a supermarket for almost 3 years, and while most of my shifts are uneventful, there's one night I'll never forget. It was my first time closing alone, and what started as a normal shift turned into something I still can't explain. It was a Wednesday night, and the store was unusually quiet. By 9 p.m., most of the customers had cleared out, leaving me and my coworker Mark to finish restocking shelves and cleaning up. Mark was in charge of the front end, while I was sent to tidy up the back aisles and check the walk-in freezers. The freezer section has always creeped me out a little. The long aisles lined with frosted glass doors seemed to amplify every sound, and the harsh fluorescent lights cast weird reflections off the ice. But it wasn't until I stepped into the storage area behind the freezers that the night took a strange turn. The walk-in freezer is massive, like a small warehouse filled with shelves of frozen goods. As I stepped inside, the icy air stung my skin, and my breath came out in visible puffs. The door closed behind me with a loud thunk, leaving me in eerie silence. I grabbed the clipboard hanging by the entrance and started checking the inventory, trying to ignore the unsettling stillness. That's when I noticed something strange. One of the shelves near the back was completely empty, something that shouldn't have been possible. I distinctly remembered restocking that section earlier in the week. Confused, I walked over to inspect it, but the more I stared, the more uneasy I felt. The shelf wasn't just empty, it was spotless, as if it had never been used. I decided to move on and finish the checklist as quickly as possible. But as I worked, I started hearing faint noises, soft thuds, like something shifting on the shelves. At first, I thought it was just the hum of the compressors or the sound of frost settling, but the noises grew louder and more distinct. "Mark!" I called out, my voice echoing through the freezer. No response. The air felt heavier, colder, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My heart pounded as I walked toward the door, but before I could reach it, I heard a loud crash behind me. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the icy fog. A box of frozen vegetables had fallen off a shelf and spilled across the floor. I let out a shaky breath, telling myself it must have been improperly stacked. But then I saw it, a set of footprints in the frost, leading away from the box and disappearing into the shadows. They weren't mine. My throat tightened as I followed the footprints with my light, but they faded before I could see where they led. The freezer felt darker somehow, like the shadows were pressing in. I turned back toward the door, but it wouldn't budge. I yanked on the handle, panic rising as I realized I was locked in. I banged on the door, shouting for Mark, but the thick metal muffled the sound. My breath came in rapid puffs as I scanned the room, looking for any other way out. That's when I saw it, the outline of a figure standing at the far end of the freezer. It was barely visible in the dim light, its form blending into the frost-covered walls. I froze, my mind racing. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its gaze fixed on me. My flashlight flickered as I raised it, the beam shaking in my trembling hands. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice cracking. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. It was tall and thin, its face obscured by the fog. I backed away, my heart pounding as I fumbled for anything I could use as a weapon. My hand landed on a metal rod used for stocking high shelves, and I gripped it tightly. The figure stopped, its head tilting slightly as if studying me. Then, without warning, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the freezer into complete darkness. I panicked, swinging the rod blindly in front of me. The cold was unbearable now, seeping into my bones and making it hard to breathe. My flashlight sputtered back to life, just long enough for me to see the figure standing inches away, its face pale and featureless, like a mannequin made of ice. I screamed and swung the rod, but it passed through empty air. The figure was gone, and the freezer door creaked open behind me. I stumbled out into the storage area, collapsing to my knees as warm air hit my face. Mark found me minutes later, pale and shaking. "What happened?" he asked, helping me to my feet. I tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come. When we checked the freezer, everything was normal. No fallen boxes, no footprints, nothing to suggest what I'd seen. But the empty shelf was still spotless, as if it had never been used. I quit the supermarket a few weeks later. I couldn't go near the freezer section without feeling that same icy dread. Sometimes, late at night, I think about the figure and wonder what it wanted, and I pray I never find out. I've worked at plenty of places over the years, but the supermarket I worked at in 2021 had a reputation among the employees, a reputation no one liked to talk about. Some of the older workers joked that the store was cursed, but most people just laughed it off as superstition. I wasn't so sure after what I experienced one night during a closing shift. It was late November, a few days before Thanksgiving, and the store was unusually quiet for the season. Most customers had already done their holiday shopping earlier in the week, leaving the aisles eerily empty. I was assigned to clean and organize the back shelves in aisle 13, the miscellaneous section, where we kept out items like seasonal decorations, batteries, and storage bins. The lights in aisle 13 were always dimmer than the rest of the store, giving it a shadowy, almost claustrophobic feel. It didn't help that the shelves were crammed with random items, some of which hadn't been touched in years. It was the kind of aisle you avoided unless you absolutely had to go there. The shift started like any other. My coworker Jasmine was mopping the front entrance while our manager, Mr. O'Leary, counted tills in the office. It was just the three of us that night, and with no customers around, the store felt too quiet. The faint hum of the fluorescent lights seemed louder than usual, and every creak of the building made me jump. I was halfway through organizing a shelf of leftover Halloween decorations when I heard it, a faint shuffling sound coming from the far end of the aisle. I paused, my hand hovering over a plastic jack-o'-lantern. The sound came again, soft and irregular, like footsteps dragging across the tile floor. "Jasmine?" I called out, my voice echoing slightly. "Is that you?" No answer. I peered around the corner, expecting to see her with the mop, but the aisle was empty. The air felt heavier somehow, and the faint scent of something metallic lingered in my nose. I brushed it off as my imagination and went back to work. A few minutes later, the sound returned, louder this time. It was unmistakable now. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming closer. My heart pounded as I turned toward the noise, gripping the edge of the shelf for support. At the end of the aisle, partially obscured by the shadows, was a figure. It was hard to make out in the dim light, but it looked like a person. A tall, lanky shape standing perfectly still. I couldn't see their face, but I could feel their gaze locked on me. The air grew colder, and my hands trembled as I took a step back. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. "The store's closing soon. You need to leave." The figure didn't move. I took another step back, my heart racing. "Look, if you don't leave, I'll call security." Still nothing. Before I could react, the store's intercom crackled to life, blasting static through the speakers. The sudden noise startled me so badly that I dropped the box I was holding, sending plastic decorations clattering to the floor. When I looked up, the figure was gone. I bolted down the aisle and ran to the front of the store, where Jasmine was still mopping. "Did you see anyone back there?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She frowned and shook her head. "No. Why?" "There was someone in aisle 13, I stammered. "I saw them." She gave me a skeptical look. "There's no one here but us and Mr. O'Leary." I glanced toward the office, where the manager's door was slightly ajar. The faint glow of his desk lamp spilled into the hallway, but he didn't seem to notice the commotion. Jasmine shrugged and went back to mopping, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I reluctantly returned to aisle 13, my nerves on edge. The decorations I'd knocked over were scattered across the floor, but there was no sign of the figure. I bent down to pick them up, telling myself it was probably just a trick of the light. Then I saw it. Etched into the tile floor, hidden beneath the scattered decorations, was a single word scratched into the surface. Leave. My blood ran cold as I stared at the jagged letters. They were fresh, the grooves sharp and deep, as if carved with something sharp. I scrambled to my feet and backed away, my breath coming in short gasps. "Jasmine!" I yelled, running back to the front. "We need to get out of here." She looked up, startled. "What are you talking about?" "There's something in the store," I said, grabbing her arm. "We need to go." Before she could respond, the intercom crackled again, this time emitting a low, guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. It wasn't static, it was a voice. A deep, raspy whisper that seemed to echo through the empty aisles. "Get out." Jasmine's face turned pale as the mop clattered to the floor. "What the hell was that?" she whispered. "I don't know," I said, pulling her toward the exit, "but we're not sticking around to find out." We ran for the doors, not bothering to lock up. As we stepped outside, the store lights flickered and dimmed, plunging the interior into darkness. For a moment, I thought I saw the figure again, standing just inside the glass doors, watching us leave. Neither of us spoke as we got into our cars and drove away. The next day, I called in sick and started looking for a new job. I never went back to that store, and I don't think I ever will. I started working at Grover's Market during my senior year of high school. It was one of those small-town supermarkets where everyone knows everyone, and you can't walk down an aisle without bumping into someone you recognize. It was a simple job: stock shelves, bag groceries, and clean up at the end of the night. Nothing too exciting, but there was one part of the store that everyone avoided: the stockroom mirrors. The stockroom was in the back, a cluttered space filled with pallets of canned goods, dusty shelves, and flickering fluorescent lights. Against one wall, there was a large mirror, one of those old, slightly warped ones that made your reflection look strange. For as long as I could remember, that mirror had given me the creeps. Something about it felt off, like it didn't just reflect what was in front of it. Whenever I had to go into the stockroom, I'd make it a point to keep my back to the mirror. Some of the older employees said it was haunted, but I figured they were just trying to mess with the new hires. Still, the stories stuck with me. One night, I was assigned to the closing shift. It was just me and the assistant manager, Claire, who was counting the registers in the office. The store was empty. No customers, no background chatter, just the hum of the freezers and the occasional creak of the old building settling. Around 9:30, Claire asked me to restock a display of soda bottles near the front of the store. The extra inventory was in the stockroom, which meant I'd have to face the mirror. I grabbed the dolly and headed to the back, trying to ignore the unease creeping up my spine. The stockroom was colder than usual, the air heavy and stale. As I loaded the soda bottles onto the dolly, I felt the distinct sensation of being watched. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see Claire standing there, but the room was empty. That's when I made the mistake of looking at the mirror. At first, everything seemed normal, just my reflection, slightly distorted by the warped glass. But as I stared, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. In the mirror, there was someone else standing behind me. It was a woman, her figure faint and translucent, like a shadow barely clinging to form. Her face was pale and expressionless, her eyes dark hollows that seemed to stare straight through me. I spun around, but the stockroom was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the woman was gone. My hands were shaking as I loaded the last of the soda bottles onto the dolly. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I pushed the dolly out of the stockroom and tried to shake off the feeling of unease. By the time I finished setting up the soda display, it was almost 10 p.m. Claire poked her head out of the office and said she was heading home early, leaving me to lock up. I didn't mind. I'd closed the store before, and it wasn't a big deal. But as soon as she left, the store felt different. The silence was oppressive, and every creak and groan of the building made me jump. I busied myself with cleaning up, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread. When I went to take out the trash, I passed by the mirror in the stockroom. I glanced at it, just for a second, and froze. This time, the woman wasn't alone. There were two figures now, both faint and translucent, their faces pale and featureless. They stood side by side, their heads tilted slightly, as if watching me. My reflection stared back at me, but it didn't move when I did. It just stood there, motionless, as the figures in the mirror grew sharper, more defined. I backed away, my heart racing. The air felt colder, heavier, and the faint sound of whispering filled the room. It was low and garbled, like a dozen voices speaking at once. I bolted out of the stockroom, slamming the door behind me. The rest of the night was a blur. I finished my closing duties as quickly as I could, avoiding the back of the store entirely. When I locked up and stepped outside, the cool night air felt like a lifeline. But as I turned to look back at the store, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the reflection of the front windows, I saw them. The figures from the mirror, standing just behind the glass. Their hollow eyes stared at me, unblinking, as their faint outlines began to fade into the darkness. I never worked a closing shift again after that night. A few weeks later, I quit the job entirely. I still don't know what I saw in that mirror, but every time I pass by Grover's Market, I feel their eyes on me, watching, waiting. I'd been working as a cart collector for a large supermarket chain for about a year when it happened. My job was simple: collect the stray shopping carts from the parking lot and bring them back to the corral by the store's entrance. Most of the time, it was uneventful, even boring, but every now and then, I'd get stuck with the closing shift. That's when things got weird. It was early spring, and the sun had just set when my manager, Doug, handed me the keys to the cart shed. "Finish up out there, and don't forget to lock up when you're done," he said, patting me on the shoulder. The store was already closed, and the last few employees were clocking out, leaving me alone in the lot. The parking lot stretched far beyond the store, with only a few dim streetlights to break up the darkness. Most of the carts were clustered near the entrance, but there were always a few stragglers scattered farther out. As I wheeled a stack of carts back to the corral, I noticed one lone cart sitting at the far end of the lot, right next to the tree line. I sighed, already tired from the long shift, but I knew I couldn't leave it there. Grabbing my flashlight, I started toward the cart, the beam cutting through the hazy glow of the streetlights. The further I walked, the quieter it got. The distant hum of the freeway faded, and even the crickets seemed to go silent. When I reached the cart, I realized something strange. It wasn't one of ours. Our store had bright red carts with the store's logo printed on the handle, but this one was black, with no markings at all. It was old and rusted, the wheels caked with dirt, as if it had been sitting out there for years. I bent down to examine it, shining my flashlight over the worn metal. That's when I noticed the scratches. Carved into the cart's handle were faint, jagged letters that spelled out a single word: help. A chill ran down my spine. I straightened up, suddenly aware of how quiet the lot had become. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I turned back toward the store, but before I could take a step, I heard it, a faint, squeaking sound, like cart wheels rolling over asphalt. I swung the flashlight around, but the lot was empty. The cart was still in front of me, motionless. I told myself it was just the wind and grabbed the cart, pushing it back toward the corral. The wheels screeched loudly as I moved, the sound echoing across the empty lot. As I neared the store, I glanced back over my shoulder and froze. In the distance, at the edge of the tree line, stood a figure. It was barely visible in the dim light, but I could make out its shape, a tall, shadowy figure standing perfectly still, as if watching me. My chest tightened as I fumbled for my phone, but when I looked up again, the figure was gone. I pushed the cart into the corral and locked it up as quickly as I could, my hands shaking. I just wanted to get back inside, but as I turned toward the store, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Another cart was sitting in the middle of the lot. It wasn't there a minute ago, and it looked exactly like the first one. Black, rusted, and covered in dirt. The scratches on the handle glinted faintly under the streetlights. I wasn't about to go near it. I sprinted toward the store, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I ran. When I reached the entrance, I yanked on the door, but it was locked. My manager had already left, and I didn't have the keys to get back inside. That's when I heard it again, the squeaking sound of cart wheels. I turned slowly, my heart pounding. The black cart was moving toward me, its wheels screeching against the pavement. There was no one pushing it, no wind strong enough to move it. Just the cart, rolling steadily toward me as if it had a mind of its own. I backed away, tripping over my own feet and falling hard onto the asphalt. The flashlight slipped from my hand, skittering across the ground. I scrambled to my feet, my eyes locked on the cart as it stopped a few feet away. Then I saw the figure again. It was standing next to the cart, its form barely visible in the darkness. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its presence, a heavy, suffocating weight pressing down on me. I didn't stick around to find out what it wanted. I bolted for the parking lot exit, leaving the flashlight behind. When I reached my car, I jumped in, locked the doors, and sped out of there without looking back. The next day, I called Doug and told him I was quitting. I didn't give him a reason, and I didn't care if he was mad. I just wanted to be done with that place. A few weeks later, I heard that another cart collector had quit after seeing something similar in the lot. I never told anyone what happened that night, but sometimes, when I'm driving late at night and pass a supermarket parking lot, I catch myself scanning the edges for that black cart, and every time, I pray I never see it again.